before we actually write any Firestore database code, we have to understand a couple fundamental concepts about how Firestore's database works. It'll help us also understand what it is that we're actually going to do from a coding perspective. But before that, in order for me to show you these concepts, we actually have to go into the database. The first thing we want to do is click this database tab inside of the develop sidebar. In here, we want to select create database. And we'll get prompted with one of two options. Now, the first one is called locked mode and the second is test mode. And this is essentially the beginning security rules that are set up for our new Cloud Firestore database when we create it. Locked mode essentially prevents anyone from reading and writing to our storage. Test mode doesn't matter. It means that anybody can read and write to our database. Now, what does that mean? Well, this is one of those concepts. On the right-hand side here, you'll see what looks like an odd version of some JavaScript code. And what this says is this is kind of like a rule that we can write inside of our Cloud Firestore that will either allow or deny different permissions of what people can do. What do I mean by this? Let's say you had a user that wanted to fetch all of the data related to the users. Like they wanted a list of all the users. Well, if we were storing sensitive information on those users, we would not want anyone to be able to do that, let alone modify that data. So using this block of code here inside of our database, we're able to have the flexibility to control what people are able to do and not able to do. It's essentially like we're setting restrictions on what rules we want to enforce so that our database is as secure as possible. So we, to begin, want to start in test mode, and we'll end up writing some rules so that we'll get more secure as we go, but we just want to explore this for now. So let's enable it, and it will end up creating our first database for us. Now, once we're in here, that rules tab is actually those things that I was talking about. This is where we'll see those rules, the first one on the right side. So here we can edit them, but we'll figure out that later, I promise. What we really want to see though is this data. So in Firestore, this database is what's called a NoSQL database. It's essentially a fancy way of saying that our database consists of one gigantic JSON object. There are two types of data inside of our database, and they're more conceptual. So the first one is called a collection. A collection is exactly as it sounds. It's like a group of objects, except those objects are the second type of data called documents. So you can almost see them as an array of things. And each of those things can also have properties that point to other collections. So let's do an example. Let's say we add a collection called users. We'll click next, and now we suddenly have this path inside of our database /users, and that is a collection. And in this collection, let's say we added a new document. In other words, a new user. We can auto-generate the ID because every object or document needs a unique identifier so that we know that in the users, the document with this ID is that specific user. And then let's say they had a display name of the value Yihua. So if I save this, now in my collection of users, there is a document with the ID of what we just saw with the display name of Yihua. This thing you see on the right-hand side is the document itself. And then inside of this document, we can actually add a collection. So for example, let's say our user also had cart items, right? Like they picked some items and they added it to their cart, but they haven't checked it out yet. And in there, we'll also generate a new ID because the first cart item they got was, let's say the name of the item was blue hat. So now, inside of our users collection, for this user of Yihua, he has a property which is a collection of cart items. And in that collection of cart items, there is a document of the cart item blue hat. He could have multiple different cart items. Let's say he had another one with a unique ID as well. And the name of that was leather jacket. So here we see our cart items collection on our user Yihua has this 2 items inside of it, 2 documents. So that's essentially the main thing in our database. It just consists of collections and documents. And then those documents might have their own collections and documents. Now, that's the idea behind how things are stored in our database. But the way that we would query for them is like so. Now, we already know that we have Firebase imported, and then we have our Firestore. And we remember exporting out const firestore equals firebase.firestore. Well, with this, how we actually query those documents is we would literally say something like firestore.collection, right? Because we want that collection, and then we're saying users. What this will query for us is this collection, right? It'll give us the identifier for this collection. If we wanted to say, go into that users and then find this document, we would say .doc, and then we would pass it the ID of that document that we're looking for, i.e. that user. So we're saying Firestore, get me the collection called users, and then get me the document with this ID. And then from here, we can still keep chaining and say, of that user document that you just got me, I want his collection of cart items. And then you can, from here, also do .doc, right? And we can fetch that specific cart item we want. Whether we want the blue hat or the leather jacket, we would just copy that ID. What this is essentially saying is we're asking Firestore to get us the collection of users. And then from the collection, we want the specific document with this ID. So this specific user. And then from that user, we want its property collection called cart items. And from that cart items, we want the specific document with this ID. By calling this chain, Firestore will end up getting us the object reference to this specific item nested inside of that users, user, cart items, and then that specific cart item. If we were to go back to our application now, the other way we could query for this specific document is if we did it like this. So if we wanted this specific document, we could also say firestore.doc and then /users/ this ID /cart items /this ID. So this is equivalent to writing this. And if we wanted this collection of cart items, it's exactly as you would imagine. Instead of saying .doc, we would say .collection, and then we would paste the string up until this point. So these are the two main methods of how we can get documents and collections from our database. Now that we know how to query for them, there will be ways and methods on these objects that we get that allow us to update them as well. But we'll see how to do that when we actually start implementing that code into our application. What we're going to do is we're going to store these authenticated users that we get back from our auth library inside of our database. Because right now, these users are not actually being stored in our database. They're currently held inside of this authentication area, and Firebase is aware whenever a user signs in, whether or not they've signed in before, because it is storing those users. But we are not actually storing those users in our database. So there's no usage for us with those user objects in any relation to what we could do with them inside of our database. So let's see what we're going to do.